You're listening to the Speaking Tongues podcast. I'm your host, El Charisse. Each week, I sit down to a conversation with multilinguals where we discuss and celebrate language, life, and culture through our own perspectives. Episode 63, Speaking Australian English. Hello, language lovers. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Speaking Tongues, the podcast and conversation with multilinguals. Today, I'm speaking with Penny and Bec from the Language Chats podcast, and we are talking about Australian English. I absolutely love talking about every language, but talking about English spoken in different parts of the world is always so much fun for me because I get to learn about how my own native language is expressed in different parts of the world. So I knew that when I was ready to talk about Aussie English, I had to come to my favorite Australian language podcasters for a chat. In this episode, we talk about how second languages taught in Victoria tend to be Asian languages like Mandarin and Japanese. We talk about how multilingualism is expressed among multilingual communities through the country and how the prevalence of these communities can inform the second language offerings in schools. When it comes to English, we talk about the informal nature of Australian culture and language, accents around Australia, and how immigration has created a mix of heritage language and English. We also discuss Indigenous Australians and the efforts that are taken and can be taken regarding acknowledging the heritage of First Peoples. And of course, we have to dispel some popular stereotypes like, do Australians even put shrimps on a barbie? Where did that even come from? Big thank you to Penny and Bec for this fun conversation and for teaching us a bit about Australia. If you enjoy this episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the Speaking Tongues podcast on Apple Podcasts, or like and subscribe on YouTube so that other language lovers like ourselves can find the show. And if you've been a longtime listener of the show or even a recent listener, you can now support the show on buymeacoffee.com. Links to all platforms are in the show notes. Okay, let's chat. Welcome back to another episode of Speaking Tongues. I am here with Bec and with Penny from Language Chats. How are you, ladies?
Great, thank you. Thanks for having us, Elle.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
I'm so excited to talk to you, and I know you guys are all the way in Australia, and I love doing these like massive time difference talks. Like it's a little like it's so much fun for me. It's like all I wanted in my life. Just talk to people on the other side of the world. I like to start each episode with the same question, and that is to both of you. What is your first language and which languages have you learned to speak?
Well, my first language is English, and I started properly learning languages probably when I was in high school. French, Japanese, a little bit of Indonesian, and I carried on Japanese through to university and picked up Vietnamese as well. And then Chinese I added as an adult. But they're probably my core.
Very cool.
My first language is also English. The first language that I started learning was French, and I learnt French all through my school years. But at school, I also had to do Japanese and Indonesian. You're probably seeing a pattern here. And then as an adult, I then picked up German and then some Italian, and I've recently started learning Danish.
Wow. We've got like a United Nations here. I love it. So Japanese and Indonesian, were those languages compulsory or were they optional and you guys were just interested in learning them? How did that work?
For me, yeah, the languages actually, we did have to have a compulsory element for about maybe a couple of years in high school. But then I was loving it so much that I continued with Japanese and French for a little bit as well. But I think the push for Japanese was really strong in the 1990s, which is when I went to school. Beck is about 10 years younger than me, but she can answer that in a sec.
I'm a
And
90s girl too, so.
so, there was a huge, economic push, trade push with Australia and Japan. And so Japanese was seen as a very logical, sensible language to be pushing in schools. It's still really popular now, but I would say Chinese has also come on as probably another popular Asian language being taught. Would you say that, Beck, as well?
Yep, definitely. I agree. I think so. I was in the 90s, I was more in like kind of the primary school years. And when I first started, so it very much depended on what school you went to, because each school kind of has their, I guess, freedom to choose whatever language they would like to choose, whatever teachers they have to teach the language. And things like French and Italian, especially in sort of, I guess, in the 90s in particular, were very popular at the junior levels. But then increasingly, so yeah, at a higher, more senior level, Japanese, I remember being very popular then and was still kind of being pushed. But the transition to Japanese being the kind of preferred Asian language to Mandarin Chinese becoming the preferred Asian language to teach at school sort of happened as I was going through high school. And then I think now that's probably a much more evident shift, where now even at much younger years, Mandarin Chinese is very popular as the first second language to teach to students, at least in the state that we live in. So it can vary quite significantly across the country in Australia, and it's a big place. And yeah, it's very much about this kind of, I think, sense of regional relevance that drives what languages have sort of been promoted as a good option for school students to learn.
Do you know of like what popular languages there are for students to learn in other regions of Australia?
Penny, I don't know if you've got a little bit more of an insight into that.
I was going to say, I mean, they're pretty similar, but what I think we do find is that some schools might pick up on a community language that's popular in their suburb or their region. So, for example, Vietnamese is a good example. Some schools speak that because they're living in a quite a big Vietnamese population. Auslan, so that's our sign language as well. And indigenous languages are becoming more popular to be taught in schools, and that is quite regional specific as well. So depending on which part of the country, which language you would be teaching.
And hopefully in the future, I think that will grow. I think it would be really nice to see more awareness and more accessibility for especially younger students to have that kind of connection perhaps to Indigenous languages. But yeah, I suppose in the area that we live, and Victoria is one of the most popular, I would say is it the second most populous state in Australia after New South Wales? Yeah, I think that's probably right. So like as a kind of general view, the top 6 languages that were studied at our final year of high school in 2019, so last year, I've got info on that, but the first one was Chinese as a first language. So we have both a first language and second language split sometimes too. So Chinese as a first language, French, Japanese as a second language, Italian, Chinese as a second language, and then German. So they were the top 6 foreign languages studied at our final year of high school in our state, in Victoria. So that probably already gives you a little bit of a and kind of an overarching view to see how there is a mixture of Asian and European, the kind of traditional European languages for study. And that also in some ways mirrors the way that people view foreign languages and their kind of usefulness here as well.
Right. Tell me about when you were in school and you started studying languages. What was that like? I'm saying this because, Australia, like the US, like the UK, is an English speaking country. And I know that as many of us are native English speakers, there's not that much emphasis placed on learning a foreign language for fluency, where in other countries, from my perspective, I feel like it's so, um, like everybody does it. It's so popular and expected of students. So in Australia, as you both are learning languages, and I guess your colleagues, and from what you notice of people around you, what was the attitude toward that? How did people feel about it?
Very, very much. Why are you bothering? Because everyone speaks English in the world. We we live on an island, so naturally we are geographically removed from other countries. Like to get to Indonesia or to Papua New Guinea, we have to fly, um, and so I think that that kind of sense that we have to know other languages is not something that's in our psyche as Australians. So I think when I was growing up, it was like, oh, that's cool. What are you going to do? You're going to be an interpreter, or maybe go into teaching. I'm just like, oh, I don't know, just for fun, maybe. um, that there was a sense that why you've got to have a really good reason to be interested in languages, and it has to be linked somehow to your career or to money. I mean, I think you found that too, Beck, right? Like,
Yeah, I think it was kind of, there's a little bit of puzzlement, sort of,
mm,
when people, like, the idea of learning a language, yeah, it definitely feels like it has to be connected to a particular objective. Like, yeah, do you enjoy it so much that you'd teach it? Or are you considering moving somewhere else to use that language? So do you want to become a diplomat and use your language skills somewhere else because you're not going to be able to use them in Australia? Or, yeah, very much I wouldn't say that it was really about learning a language for pleasure. I don't think that people necessarily had that sort of idea in their minds, and in some ways it's partly also the narrative that kind of funding for languages and stuff puts forward. So the idea that we would support languages that have some kind of economic benefit for us to know really predisposes people to thinking that it's only worth learning if it's useful in that way. Whereas, as people who love and enjoy languages, we now know as adults that it's not necessarily about that. Like, yes, sometimes it is. Sometimes it's very much about like a means to an end. You need to be able to learn a language to be able to conduct business in it, for example. But especially these days when so many people do speak English, we have many other motivations about why we think that learning a language is good. We think it's interesting. We think it's a social good. To know
Right.
and learn other languages. It's interesting. It's a part of heritage. It's, for many people as well in Australia, and I'm guessing this would also be true for many people in the US and other English speaking countries. When you do have a family background that is connected to linguistic heritage, there's something very deep and emotional about knowing that there might be a language in your history. So my family, although I never learnt this language, but my mum's side of the family speaks Hokkien, which is a Chinese
cool.
language or an Asian language. I'm not going to say dialect because I think that's what I always used to say as a kid, and now I know that it's actually not a very good description of what Hokkien is. But
Right.
it's just what it's what my mum and what my family used to say. I said, "Oh, it's a dialect of Chinese." Not quite, but I grew up listening to that language a lot because my grandparents looked after me a lot of the time before I started school. And I had a very close connection with them. And in my mind, I would love one day to learn some Hokkien properly because although for me, it's not it's not a language I could speak. I understand very, very sparse vocabulary, and it's the things that I remember from when I was a kid, things like sleep and milk and bread and vegetables, like that sort of stuff. But I know that it's a part of like my family's story. And I think lots of other people have that kind of connection to their languages too, whether it's Greek, whether it's Vietnamese, whether it's Mandarin Chinese, whether it, could be all manner of languages from all around the world. And these are all good reasons too to have a connection with a language, not because necessarily they're just useful for an economic purpose or for an occupational purpose. They can be much, much more than that. And that's an interesting and important thing for kind of human history.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you feel like attitudes are changing and people are more open and embracing than they were like, when you were in school?
Yeah, I would say so. I think that there has been some change in that. I think people are maybe it's partly the accessibility of resources and stuff too that I think people realize now, and also the people have traveled more. Let's just like exclude the last 18 months. But yeah, Australians love to travel. For a not very big population, we sometimes it feels like there are Australians everywhere when you're traveling. And, we do like to get
Yeah.
out. And partly I think that's related to just isolation. We feel like we have to get out of the country sometimes. But I think that often gives people real motivation as an adult to go, I'd love to learn some, you've spent this fantastic holiday in, I don't know, Italy or France, wherever. And you go, actually, I would have really liked to be able to speak some of the language. And they come back and they go, actually, yeah, maybe I will. And, that kind of greater awareness, I think, can help to for people to realize that language is not just something that you had to learn by heart at school in a classroom at a desk. It's a way of communicating with other people and enjoying another culture. And I think that realization is also a really positive thing.
Yeah. And I picked up on something that you were both talking about, like, in school, the option to like what were you going to do with the language was just so limited, like be a diplomat, be a teacher, be an interpreter. And like I got a lot of that too.
Mm.
And like now that I'm in this language world and I'm meeting people like yourselves and other people who really love language, I think it's so amazing. Like I never knew that I could do so much with learning a language, and I wish I could go back in time and like start over because I knew I didn't want to be a teacher, so it was like I wasn't going to do that, and I didn't think for a minute I'd be a diplomat, but I love that there's so much information out now and like people are traveling more, well, like you said, have been traveling more and have been getting out and seeing the world more, and I love that. I feel like I can't tell if it's changing in the US if people feel differently about it.
I've read some really interesting stats this week, and I don't have them on the top of my head, but it was to do with streaming multilingual shows and TVs and films and stuff like via Netflix and other platforms, and just how that has gone through the roof the last 12 months. Um, and how all the Spanish and the French and the Japanese content is just so popular now to stream in its original language, so not watching it in a dubbed version. I thought, oh, that's a good stat or something good to remind ourselves that, because that's like a real tangible thing that people are open to watching a show in another language.
For both of you, what was it or when was it when you kind of realized like, okay, this language thing is for me. Like I'm want to learn another language. I'm going to like what was your spark? What was your starting point? What made you
Mm.
go from just like the student who's trying to pass the class to like I love languages and I'm going to make this part of my life?
Oh, such a great question. I think for me, I had a year living in Vietnam when I was 18, so straight after high school. And I had the chance to learn Vietnamese while I was there. I was living there. I just soaked it up. It was the best experience. And I ended up changing what I was going to study at university, turned it into a languages degree. And I think that was it for me, just being in the country, being immersed and learning this new language was just a huge tipping point for me. But then, of course, life got interrupted and I got pulled away from languages for a good, 10 or something years. But yeah, now I'm back. So
Yeah, I think for me, probably my real realization that I liked more than one language came quite a bit later. Like, not it wasn't until language had almost disappeared from my life that I realized how much I missed it. And at that stage, I'd really only properly, like for a decent amount of time, studied French. So, like, I did Japanese for I don't know, 3 or 4 years at school, but while at the same time as doing French. But I always really liked French at school. And I kind of saw myself as just enjoying French. I liked that, and I was kind of connected to this one language. It was only once I had done, I'd sort of done all of my uni degree. I did a bit of French while I was at university still, just to keep it up. But then I sort of finished, I did a master's, and then I got into kind of the world of work. And then I really felt like I was missing something. And I sort of came to this realization that actually what I was missing in my life was the languages part of my life that had gone, and that it wasn't just French. Like I had, sort of dabbled in a couple of just like audio courses and things while I'd been on holidays. Every time I'd gone traveling, I was just interested in, understanding signs, and I wanted to learn greetings and stuff. And then I sort of realized that I was like, wait, maybe I should have kept doing something with that. And then I started learning some German. And then I was like, oh God, I've missed this so much. And that was actually kind of the sort of reawakening for me in sort of my my mid-20s, when I realized that I was like, actually, I think this is my jam. Like I was like, I'm getting so much out of this. And, and then it was kind of a slippery slope. I was suddenly like, oh, what can I learn next? And, and I was making time for it, but I never felt like it was, effort, that homework for me for like learning languages didn't feel like this like horrible weight on my shoulders, which is how I had felt about, all of the other things that I studied at uni. I studied something very, very unrelated. I kind of was realizing that this is what learning, how it's supposed to really feel pleasurable. And then I was like, what else can I do with this? And so I think, for me, it was probably a little later in the piece. And then I started, just reassessing everything. Oh, maybe I should have changed my entire degree to language. I should have done what Penny did.
Everyone has their own path, Bec.
I'm still grateful for all the experiences I had, but it is funny how you can get to that point of, I think you get built up, and probably many other people have had this experience too. You grow up being kind of taught that you'll, pick an occupation, and you'll go to university, and then you'll study that, and then you'll get a job, and then you'll have this nice linear career that sort of takes you on a path where you'll just get better and better at that thing that you studied at uni. And, in reality, for many people, it doesn't work out like that at all, because you go to university, you study something, and then you're like, well, this is not what I thought it was going to be. and then you get into a job where you're like, whoa, this is also not what I thought it was going to be. And things twist and turn just like they do on the path of learning a language. You think it's going to be this linear path where you just learn more vocabulary and you learn more grammar and you'll get really good. Actually, it goes up and down all over the place, and sometimes you lose all of your knowledge and you have to come back. And journeys are never a straight line.
Yeah.
And I think one of the great things about language in general is that it is never too late. You can always come back. You can learn at any time in your life. At no point have you missed the boat. It's just always, the boats are literally always there at the port waiting for you, ready to jump on. Like, just whenever you're ready, you just hop in and you can go for it and sail somewhere else. Yeah. Love it.
The words I needed to hear.
Like I've spoken to so many people over the years who, they'll be like, oh, I tried to learn some Italian once when I went on a holiday, or I tried to learn some French once because I had a French boyfriend or a French girlfriend, or, and I'm like, well, you could always come back to it. And they gotta go, oh, well, it was so long ago though. And I'm like, so what? You go, there's any time. And like you said before, there are so many resources now. Nothing is cut off from anybody.
Yeah. I love that I love that message that you say that, not just because like personally I'm coming to terms with that. Like I'm trying to improve my French, trying to improve my Italian, and I'm like, am I too old for this? Why am I doing this? Why didn't I do this before? And then I just tell myself now, like, just chill out, take your time, and there's nothing riding on this. It's just because it's something that I want to do. And I think that like a lot of people will say, I've always wanted to learn insert language here. And I'm like, well, why don't you do it? Like, at least learn like your numbers, the colors, the alphabet, or just something basic to just get started. And I always wonder, like, why are people like not afraid, but why are people so reluctant? Is it like
Is it because it's hard work? Because there's no shying away that
Yeah, it
from the
is.
fact that it is hard. Like it takes effort and it takes motivation and commitment, and you know it's still fun, but I always think of it as like learning a language as like working out, exercise, because motivation wanes, and I'm someone who needs accountability. So for me to turn up to my exercise class, I have to register on an app so that she knows I'm coming. And it's just like, an italki class on the internet, right? You have to register and you pay in advance and you're committed. So for me, they're two really great parallels, because that's me. I need that external push. Other people aren't like that, and that's great. I'm a bit jealous of those people, but that's me.
Yeah, I,
So
same?
I agree. I think one, it is hard work, as you say, and that can be a scary prospect. I also think that there's something a little deeper in the way that adults, especially, kind of start feeling very secure in their knowledge and their abilities in life. And actually, it can be quite stressful to consider yourself in a position where you almost regress to a childlike level of knowledge. And I think that learning a language from, as an adult, but as a beginner, can be like that. Suddenly you know nothing. Like you actually know nothing. And when someone asks you a question, you can't answer. Like you can be a full and intelligent, mature person with a job where you can do complicated things on a daily basis. And then suddenly someone tries to get you to like say what you do, or say your name or your age in another language, and you have nothing. Like suddenly you just
Right.
blank, and you're like, I haven't felt
Right.
like this since I was an age that I can't remember anymore. When you're young enough to not know how to answer a question, you can rarely can people remember that. But actually, that's kind of what learning a language can be like when you're an adult, because yeah, you suddenly have none of the words and you have to build up vocabulary to be able to communicate again. So that is, I guess that's part of hard work, but it's also a really like a quite a sort of a mental state of saying, I'm okay to
it's
feel a
huge.
bit
It's
dumb.
huge.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like I'm
because
okay to feel like a child again, and like I can't, like I'm just going to be silent for a bit until I've got enough knowledge to be able to even have a simple conversation, and
Mm.
then to be able to
Mhm.
build on that more and more and more, and that might take years. Actually, probably will
um,
take years.
putting yourself out there and completely out of your comfort zone
Mm.
is terrifying, and that's what language learning is about often. But what a great life skill to learn and share with our kids. And I mean, that's why I think language learning is such a great thing for people to take on, because not only are you learning a language, but you are really stretching yourself, you know, personally.
Right.
And I think it brings, you bring that to all other facets of your life as well. I think, yeah, out of your comfort zone. Do it, people.
This is some valuable advice. So, can we talk about Australian English?
Mhm.
Sure, we can.
That was a smooth segue into into talking about Australian English. I love this because I love how English is so different um in different English speaking countries, and I love how we all have different accents, we all have different spellings for words, we all have different names for things. Um I want to know about Australian English. What are some things that, in your opinion, make it unique?
Oh, so there's so much in this. Well, sorry. Okay, I guess the first thing I would say about what makes Australian English distinctive And this, I guess this is coming from an Australian speaker. So I feel like, maybe if you are not an Australian, like kind of you haven't grown up in Australia, but you've come to Australia and you've noticed things that people say, maybe you would have a different opinion. I think we shorten words a lot. So in some ways, for whatever better word, Australian English is a little bit lazy. I think, and we it's almost like sometimes when words are a bit too long and formal, we shorten them to make them more casual and approachable, maybe.
Is that about bringing people, getting people into, close into you as well? Because I totally agree, Beck. We are huge shorteners. I do it all the time. But I feel like it's a way of, forming relationships. Because if you speak casually together, it means you kind of, we're in,
Yeah, exactly. And it's a way of making other people feel more comfortable, as well as kind of making a conversation potentially less serious, and like less serious, not just. What do I mean by less serious? Well,
we're not formal, are we?
Yeah, we're not formal at all.
No formality. Yeah.
Yeah, very, very casual, but also to sometimes make quite serious topics a bit less scary. And actually, probably a good example of that that's very current is coronavirus, because everything about COVID, I think, and it was like people predicted this at the beginning of last year about how Australian English was going to shorten things and try and make things more casual, and then it just happened and everyone was like, oh, of course it did. Like, look at how they predicted that instead of saying isolation, everyone was going to say ISO, and instead of saying coronavirus, we were going to call it the Rona. And I think those changes happened really fast and were exactly as some linguistic experts expected it would happen, and it definitely did. Hand sanitizer became hand sanny or hand san, and suddenly everything didn't feel quite as serious anymore. And that wasn't to say that the situation was less serious, because obviously we had the full gravity of how important and necessary a bunch of measures were last year. In Melbourne in particular, we were in lockdown for quite a bit of the middle of last year, and it just, I don't know whether it was just a coping mechanism for everyone to make things be like, okay, we know it's serious, but if we can't laugh about it, then we're all just going to cry. So, yeah, we almost change our language to reflect that too, to make everybody feel more comfortable about a situation that might otherwise be quite negative.
The shortened words, is this something that happens amongst friends and family, or is it something I'd hear on the news?
Ooh, good question.
I think
more among family, I think, and friends.
Yeah. There's still, things like the news. There's still a formality, unless it's like a joking segment or it's a really lighthearted story. But yeah, there's still, we're still, we still speak proper English on the news.
Yeah, there is still, I suppose in British sort of, what do we call it? RP.
Received.
Received pronunciation. Received pronunciation in the UK. I think Australia also has its own kind of standard newsreader pronunciation, which is exactly what RP really is. So that sort of formal English for broadcasting is very much still there, as Penny says. But I think on the ground, sort of on a regular basis, even in the workplace, the shortening of words is normal, and not people would rarely blink an eye at sort of hearing, oh, I've got a meeting this arvo with
that was
the director.
Exactly what I was going to say. The Savo, it's just such a common,
Or I'm meeting some friends for a drink after work, so I need to stop by a servo to fill up the car with petrol. So things like that would in normal conversation be very, not at all unusual. You could have those kinds of conversations with a coworker, as well as your friends and family or your boss. Unless you work somewhere that's
With your
very particularly
boss?
formal. Oh, look, I mean, it depends how close you are. I suppose it could be if it's if it's a very formal workplace of some sort, then perhaps. But I think something that Australian English maybe has almost lost in most contexts is a sense of register difference. So, they're really, it would almost seem unusual to have a very, very, very formal relationship with at least your direct manager at work. You'd like to hope that you have a casual enough relationship to be able to say, I'll see you this arvo.
I would love to know if you know, how do regional dialects change? How does the Australian manner of speaking change throughout the country?
I would have to say that we're pretty standardized as a country, accent-wise. There's some slight differences between some pronunciations and definitely with some vocab. But on the whole, I think if you tested Beck and I and said, is this person from Brisbane or is this person from Perth or Sydney, we wouldn't be able to guess. Would you agree, Beck?
Yeah, I think so, especially for the main capital cities. So if like Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, in particular, there's not much difference. People often say that Adelaide has a bit of a specific accent. Adelaide is sort of west of Melbourne. It's more central, and on the southern coast. And people sometimes say that the Adelaide accent is a bit particular, but for the most part, I don't think that it's really noticeable. Sometimes people say as well that the more north you go, you sort of head towards Queensland, which is that where it's sort of tropical, lots of beaches, the kind of Australia that people picture in their minds, white sand and coral reefs. That it tends to change more the further away you sort of get in that direction. But it's also that it's a big country. I think the regional areas, compared to the cities, there's probably sometimes a little bit of difference there, but realistically, Australia is still a young place, I think, and that means that our regional accents, there hasn't really been time for them to develop, and there's probably been too much movement throughout the country over the short history of Australia as well for anything to develop that's very, very, very distinctive. Unlike other places in the world where the history is longer and people had less movement between regional areas, and that meant that the way that you spoke in Yorkshire in the UK became significantly different to the way that you might speak in the southern part of the UK, or the way that you speak in Scotland is very obviously different to the way that you speak in Ireland. That sort of separation, I'm not sure that we've ever had that. If anything,
too much of a hodgepodge.
Too much of a mixture. Yeah, and there's been a lot of movement. Lots of people who even grew up in kind of what we like the country, or outside of a main city. Often people move to the main cities to perhaps for education or for work or for all sorts of reasons. So a lot of mixture. But I don't know if there's any very, very, very distinct differences.
That's so interesting because the US is a big country too. And I think about our regional, dialects, and they're so different. I mean, they're not bonkers different, but it's you can hear the difference between me, someone who lives in the Northeast, and someone who lives in Louisiana, or someone who lives in Mississippi or in Texas in the South, versus somebody who lives out west, like in California.
So even as Australians, we can detect that difference too, which I think is amazing. But I think that comes down to television and things like that. But
I'm really surprised. I thought that if I had heard someone maybe from Perth and then someone also, and then another person from Sydney that I would be able to tell, like, oh, this person's from the West, this person's from the East, and that's not the
No,
case.
no, not
That's so
really.
surprising.
Probably something that is more distinct, actually, if I think about it, is people who have some kind of cultural linguistic heritage. That might actually be more where you notice a quite distinct community-based difference in the way that they speak English in Australia. So, like, I can definitely think of people I know who, for example, have a particular cultural heritage, and actually the members of that community speak English in Australia in a particular way. So we're getting to like subsets of subsets here. You know, it's a, it's like there is a kind of broader, like, I suppose, standard Australian accent, for want of a better way of describing it. But I think that, yeah, communities, especially culturally based communities, may have their own way of using English here. And sometimes that is because of a mixture of how they use a heritage language in combination with English. Actually, it's really beautiful.
Oh,
It's this
okay.
lovely kind of diversity. Like, I know that, you know, at the Italian community in Australia, which is quite big, and actually the Greek community is another good example of that too, where, like, often families who, let's say now it would kind of be their grandparents or something. So people in their like sort of 70s, 80s and 90s now who may have immigrated to Australia in the 50s, you know, came as adults already. So they spoke their own native language, and they came to Australia, and then they learnt, they may have learnt some English already, but then they probably learnt English to be able to conduct business. However, they still
Right.
very much spoke their own home language with their family and with their community, which was quite, you know, in many cases very tight knit, because people really needed that community now that they'd moved to this new country. And often, yeah, words from those languages would make their way into their style of Australian English. And then, you know, their kids would sometimes use some of those things, but maybe only with their parents. They'd have almost another register for how they speak with their friends at school or with their, you know, in a work context. And then now their grandchildren have almost, again, it's like they know that there are these particular words that their grandparents use to describe things. Like, there was one in particular, I know this is a random example, but somebody saying how, like, you know, in Italian there is a word for fence, but many families in in Melbourne, like, you know, they'd hear their nonna or their nonno talk about the fencer, you know, and it's like it's kind of, there would be like this almost, yeah, this mixture of almost dialect, this kind of like Italo-Australian dialect that wasn't quite here nor there, but became a very like familiar and casual way of using both languages, but to a way that everybody involved knew exactly what was going on. So there's no loss of comprehension, just this really
Right.
interesting development of kind of almost I think what they call like a familect.
How, if you know at all, how have Aboriginal languages affected Australian English, or affected, I guess, where do you see Aboriginal language used in Australia? Is it in place names? Is it in names for foods, or maybe common words or phrases, or any practices or anything that goes on?
I would love to say that, you know, it's widespread and Aboriginal languages are, you know, a huge part of our everyday way of talking, but, you know, sadly that it's not the case. But place names, definitely, there are so many place names that come from an Aboriginal language of that region. Some of our animals, some of our most famous animals, kangaroo, wallaby, um, come from the Aboriginal word. I've read the other day too that a term that we say a bit, yakka. I think, I hope I'm going to say this right now.
Like hard yakka?
Hard yakka, as in terms, you know, of working hard work. The term yakka is an Aboriginal word, but there's not a lot, Beck, as well, that I can think of that we use in everyday language.
Yeah, there's a long way to go. It's a topic that really needs to be talked about more in Australia. It's a very, you know, it's emotional, and it's hard. It's actually, I think Australia's relationship with the first peoples who lived on this land before us is complicated, and it's not easy. I think, today as Australians who, identify as Australian, lived here all of our lives, I'm not comfortable with the situation. I'm not. I'll be super honest about it. I think it's, something that I think we are often a bit embarrassed by, and it's not something that gives us pride. Indigenous people in Australia have been, like, quite honestly treated terribly by our governments over the time. We were a previous colony, and we know what the history of colonization has meant for many Indigenous cultures and people and their languages. And there was just so long where people were forced to not speak languages, and that's
Yeah.
a really sad and, dark but important part of our history. Just because it's sad doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about it. In fact, it's more important that you talk about it because it is sad and dark.
Right.
And I think people are more open about that now than they were in our, more recent in our history previously. It's I think people do talk about it a lot more. There's a big discussion of the gap that there is between Indigenous communities in Australia and kind of the, white city, the rest of the population, however we might describe it.
And that gap,
And
is across everything, isn't it?
exactly,
Education, infant mortality,
health,
healthcare. It's across a whole bunch of different
yeah.
parts of life.
And the linguistic and cultural heritage part of that is just one part of many. But interestingly, it's all related. I think something that I know there's been a lot of work on is sort of the emotional impact of people losing their heritage in that way. Whether it is losing language, it's losing connections, it's also losing stories. And because there were hundreds of Indigenous languages in Australia pre-colonisation.
Mm.
And many of them were oral. Actually, I think all of them were oral languages. In terms of, we sort of rely on the records of some, many for many of those languages, the records that might have been taken at some point in the history of the last few hundred years. Somebody may have a recording, somebody might have something written down. And for some languages, that information is stronger than others. And there had been a real push in, again, more recent times to make sure that what information we do have is documented, to make sure that all of the, at least some of the very, very many Indigenous languages in Australia aren't lost.
How do you, and maybe you already answered this, but how do you feel like people are having that conversation? How do you think that people are embracing and trying to make those connections with Indigenous communities, to, I hate to say rectify the past because there is no rectification for it, but how do you see people making an attempt?
I mean, technology has a huge part to play in this, and I think we can see this every day. With access to technology and stories, people naturally can reach a broader audience. And so things like being able to talk about your language and your people and your history on a podcast or on a YouTube video or through a song, and have that broadcast widely is, a huge thing that we never used to be able to do. And I think social media as well is really important. There's just, worldwide as well, there's just been a huge push for people to acknowledge the inequity and to acknowledge the harm that's been done, and to be more, open for starters, but to be more cognizant of the fact that we have to be more proactive in learning and exposing, I suppose. Maybe that's not the
Yeah.
right word, but being part of this world that we have always been part of, but it's been kind of hidden away. So
I think a really important word that Penny just mentioned then was acknowledgement. Like, I think it's not so much about rectifying, because like obviously there are things that have happened in the past that like as a current generation we can't fix. You know, we can't
Of course.
turn back time and say, oh well, you know, the government shouldn't have taken away the children of Indigenous communities and, you know, taken them away from their families to assimilate them into white Australian culture. Like we can't go back and fix that, even though we recognise that it was terrible. But it's more about recognition and acknowledgement. It's saying we can look back, we can say that wasn't right, but we can also like more look towards the future and say, okay, well, what can you do now? How can you make sure that, you know, as I was saying before, sort of, you know, make sure that these things don't disappear, make sure that the cultures aren't gone, make sure that the, you know, the languages remain. How can they be revived within the communities that want them and need them for their own cultural heritage? It's, yeah, it is. I think it would be good to hear people talking about it more. I think that they are. There's definitely as a general topic, people do talk about it more now. There's a real focus. Well, there has been, I would say, in probably the last 5 or 10 years in this, kind of closing the gap idea, but also in acknowledging that there are some things that, like, for example, we have a national day in January, Australia Day, and for a long time, for a while now, people have been talking about that kind of being a bit of a, you know, an insensitive date to remember, because, you know, a lot of people, I don't know if you would have had this, but in Australia, like, a lot of people do kind of have this, they call it Invasion Day rather than it being Australia Day, and it was always supposed to kind of commemorate.
It's the date.
Yeah, sorry, Penny, you go on.
No, because I was just going to say, because it's the date that commemorates the arrival of the first fleet from Europe.
Yes. So it's,
arriving,
you know,
into Australia.
Yeah, like things like that. There is a sense now, I think, especially among the younger sort of generations, that there are some things that we could do to make a larger impact to recognise the people who were here first.
So I like to talk about culture on this show, as well as language and as well as colonizer history, apparently. But I things that I think of that come to mind when I hear Australia, you know, not bad things, all lovely things, amazing things. Australia is amazing. But what are some things about Australia and Australian culture that you think people should know that they may not be aware of?
What a good question.
Good question. Well, I think something that comes to mind is that the majority of Australians live in cities, and I think that is sometimes forgotten, that there's this beautiful romantic vision of us all living either on huge outback farms with our kangaroos and our cattle, or that we live right on the, you know, the ocean, which, you know, all the cities, a lot of the major cities in Australia are on the ocean. But yeah, you know, a huge proportion of our population live in built up areas, and we face a lot of the same kind of struggles and annoyances of living in a city that other people find in other countries. What else, Bec? We don't put shrimps on the barbie that much.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? What is that all about?
I think that's from Crocodile Dundee, isn't it?
Yes, Paul Hogan in
Also, we don't call them
Crocodile
shrimps,
Dundee.
we call them prawns. They're prawns in Australia, not shrimps, prawns.
But we do say Barbie.
We do say Barbie.
Hey,
that's another good shortening.
Come over the Savo for a Barbie.
That's another shortening. That's another shortened word. The Barbie. Okay.
I think probably something else that is good to know, well, I suppose this is also about geography of Australia, is that things are really far apart. I think probably much more so than lots of other places in the world, we have real like geographic separation from our major cities. And although most people live in the cities, those cities are not close. People often think that Melbourne and Sydney could be like a short drive away. It's not. It's like a 2-hour flight. So, and that for us is short. So, a 2-hour flight to Sydney from Melbourne, roughly. Perth from Melbourne is about 3.5 hours, I think. Is that right, Penny?
Yep.
Yeah.
Close
so
to 4 hours.
Yeah, Melbourne to Perth is close to 4 hours. Melbourne to Brisbane is a good 2.5, I think. The distance between Melbourne. Okay, obviously this is a bit Melbourne centric because we live close to Melbourne. But I do think about things in this kind of context. So I think the distance from Melbourne to Brisbane, which is north of here and north of Sydney, the distance from Melbourne to Brisbane is roughly the same as the distance from Melbourne to Townsville. Now, Townsville is like far north Queensland, but to give scale of how long the eastern seaboard of Australia is, like we're talking about, Brisbane being kind of halfway. Now, lots of people think that Brisbane is very north because it's in Queensland, but actually it's right at the base of Queensland, and Queensland is this hugely kind of tall state within Australia. So anyone who's listening to this might need to do a quick Google Maps check.
I just did that.
Where any of those places are, but the it's people do kind of feel like, oh well, Brisbane's kind of north. Well, actually, it's only really halfway to where it's really north. So yeah, I think that sense of scale in Australia is like to us very normal, but for many other people, and I think especially people who plan to travel here under normal circumstances, like they sort of think they could probably come to Australia for just maybe 2 weeks or something and see lots. And it's like, well, if you came for a couple of weeks, you'd probably need to see like 1 or 2 places, but you might want to stay longer if you want to do a really big trip.
And I think the other thing I would add as well is Australia gets a bad rap for dangerous creatures. And I would just say it's true. We have a lot, but they're not spiders, snakes, crocodile, sharks. There's lots of things, but in reality, we don't get to see them that often.
Yeah. They're not usually in the big cities.
That's a relief.
Yeah.
That's a relief. I feel like we get all the Australian like horror stories of like these giant like spiders and the like fire ants and like all these like crazy things, and I'm like, Australians are so brave because nature's dangerous there. But
not really. We're not really that brave, no. We just stay away from them all.
Let's talk about your respective endeavors. I know that you both co-host Language Chats podcast. Penny, I know you have your Lingo Mama blog, and Bec, you have Irregular Endings. Tell us all about that. Tell us how you got started. What are some of your goals with these endeavors? And of course, most importantly, please tell us where we can find you.
Well, about 3 years ago, Bec was presenting at the Online Women in Language Conference, and I was attending my first ever language type event. And I was like, oh, this girl's from Melbourne. I really need to reach out and say hi and see if we can meet up. And so we did. And then we met up and we decided we had all these amazing language things in common. We loved learning languages and talking about languages, and really none of our friends really understood us when we did. So we found someone that we could finally talk to. And so we talked about building a little community, which we have, Language Lovers AU. And then from there, that's kind of snowballed, hasn't it, Bec, that we decided we wanted to try and do a podcast. And so we podcast now under the name of Language Chats. And we've been doing that for 2 years. And yeah, we release an episode every fortnight, and it's just really fun.
Yeah, and it's pretty much as well, I think we were realizing that we were having language chats every time we caught up, which was really fun and light and casual, but sort of the way that neither of us are teachers. We're just people who are interested in languages, and that kind of casual sort of chat was what we wanted to share a little bit more of. And now too, we have the opportunity to interview people a little bit more as well. Primarily other Australians who either speak or work with or are interested in languages, as well as a few international guests here and there, but to just help share a little bit more that Australia is filled with lots of people who speak other languages and who use them day to day and who are interested in them, and that despite the fact that sometimes it can really feel like a monolingual place where it's just English everything. Actually, there are lots of people here who do lots of cool things with languages. So I suppose that's sort of part of our mission with language chats and what we want to share.
And I started Lingo Mama around the same time that about 3 years ago now, and it was just really as a way for me to I just had a baby and I really wanted to get back into language learning, and I thought, you know what? Some external accountability is probably a really good way to do it. So I thought let's tell people that I'm starting to get back into Chinese and see what happens. And I love going on language trips. So for me, immersing myself in the culture of the language that I'm studying is just the best thing for me. I love it so much. And I luckily, before the pandemic, I was able to take my family and some friends as well on a couple of language trips. We went to Taiwan to learn Mandarin Chinese and also to Vietnam to learn Vietnamese. And it's just a really awesome feeling to do a bit of language study and then be able to use that language that you're learning and practicing out in the real world.
And where can we find your blog?
So I'm under lingomama.com and
Awesome.
Instagram as well. Yeah.
Cool.
And so Irregular Endings is my little project that I have on the side too. And that started a little bit earlier, probably about 5 years ago now, actually almost 6 years ago. And so I really wanted a way to be able to also bring languages back into my life. At the time, I very much had a job that was really nothing to do with languages, not even a little bit. And something that I'm quite a creative person. I love drawing. And I just kind of thought maybe I could put something together that kind of combines those a little bit, get sort of a passion project going outside of my working life. And so I started creating initially some vocabulary cards. I don't really make those anymore, but it started there. Some little illustrated vocab cards. And then sort of thought, oh, maybe I'll make some little greeting cards in other languages. I wonder if other people will be interested in that. And then it kind of just went from there. I just sort of added a few things here and there, did a few more greeting cards, created some notepads, just a bunch of products that I thought other people like me who were interested in languages and might want to share, even simple words with other people who they know, whether they're people who do speak those languages or don't. And yeah, just simple kind of creative things that made other languages feel a bit more kind of normal day to day in everyday life. And yeah, that's basically what it is.
And where can we find Irregular Endings?
So you can find me at irregularendings.com.au, or also on Instagram at irregular.endings.
Perfect. I love that you both took your interests and made them, your interest in language and made it fit into your lives. Like, with your interest in travel, Penny, and with your art, Bec, I think it's a really organic thing that I hope people listening can take from that and realize that there's so many ways to bring language into your life and to meld it with the things that you love and that you're interested in. What I will do is I will add your links to all of your projects in the show notes so that people who are listening will be able to just click and find you right away and reach out, hopefully, with kindness. as we always encourage on this show. I want to say thank you both so much for this conversation, and I've really enjoyed talking to you both. I always enjoy talking to fellow podcasters and and talking about language, and I love these three-person conversations as well. I like to end each episode on the same question, and that is, do you have any jokes, tongue twisters, cool slang words, idioms, words of wisdom, or words of advice in Australian English, or something that you typically hear in Melbourne to share?
Oh,
It's such a
well,
good
I know
question.
it is a good question. I know, Elle, we've talked about how we shorten lots of words, but we do have some really crazy slang words. And then I'm just like, I hope that these are Australian, that we're just not like, ripping them off other countries. Um, but I guess lots of things to do with, chockers is one that I use a lot. I don't know if you ever say that, Beck, but oh, this train is chock a block, or this train is chockers, and it just means like really full or overcrowded, or oh, my day is chockers, can we do it tomorrow? Or um, so that's just a really funny. I know we're talking about idioms, but that's just a really slang word that is kind of funny that I do actually use in real life.
I love that. I've never heard that before. Or if I have heard it, I didn't know what it meant.
I think also we have lots of like shortenings for things that we see day to day that end in O. Like a service station becomes servo. The I'm trying to think. The bottle shop becomes bottle-o. I suppose afternoon goes to arvo. I'm not sure where those came from or why we do that shortening, but that is something you would hear a lot. Something else that is quite specific to Melbourne. Well, I think it's specific to Melbourne, although maybe this is just a more general like kind of modern thing these days. I don't know. Maybe in New York City you see this sometimes too. So see what you think. But I've had a few conversations lately with friends about the way that when you go into a restaurant these days, in Melbourne in particular, the way they introduce the menu. And like maybe it's been over the last, say, 5 years or so, there are sharing plates everywhere. Everything is designed for sharing. And something that I've really noticed in restaurants is that there's almost a bit of a playbook of how people greet you in a restaurant now in Melbourne, especially if it happens to be a little bit trendy. They sort of walk in and say to you, hi everyone, how are you going? Yeah, good, thanks, all good. Have you dined with us before? Have you been here before? You go, oh, well, once before. Well, our menu is designed for sharing. Whether that is specific to Melbourne or whether it reaches a little bit further than that, I'm not sure. But it's definitely a conversation I was having just recently with a bunch of friends where we were like, are we the only ones who do that? Like, does everybody know this script? Is this just a new hospitality way of introducing the menu at every restaurant in Melbourne? I don't know.
I'm going to have to think about that one. I've heard everything up until our menu is designed for sharing. But I think the rest of it is like, yeah, I've definitely heard that. I think there's like an international restaurant standard, perhaps.
Yeah.
Were you going to add something, Penny?
Well, I was just going to say what Beck was saying, that Melburnians, and that's a term we use a lot, Melburnians, is there's always been this stereotype that Melburnians wear black clothing and drink a lot of coffee, and I think there is some truth in that compared to the other cities in Australia. So that's just a little aside for people who might one day be travelling to our lovely country, that they might find that to be true.
So what you're saying is that Melbourne and New York are the same.
Maybe.
Yeah. Basically, that's how great Melbourne is. It's as good as New York City.
Bec and Penny, thank you so much for this conversation. I've really enjoyed chatting with you and learning so much more about your part of Australia and about the languages that you speak. really quickly, don't think about it too hard. But if we were in Melbourne and we had just had this conversation and we're talking and laughing and chatting, and then it's time to go, what is the best way to say goodbye?
I
Or a
usually say,
typical way to say goodbye?
take care, see you soon. That's what I normally say.
See you later.
Well, see you later. Take care. See you soon. And I'll be talking to you ladies soon.
Thanks, Elle. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Elle.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.